Hey, what's going on? You made it to chapter 4, so that's a pretty good sign. You're on week 2. Well, we're going to talk about activity-based costing, and you may want to get your book out, follow along through these PowerPoints. There are a few exhibits and displays that are in the book, and I think it might be easier for you to look at your online book or something like that. Just a suggestion. There'll be pictures on the screens. So here's the deal. We are doing costing. So we've been talking about our pencil, right? And we got direct costs like the direct materials and the direct labor. And then we got overhead, right? Well, same thing here. Here's a mechanical pencil. Direct materials, direct labor. We can count the prime costs, right? That's easy. It's that overhead that starts to get confusing. So overhead, let's say there's some engineering that goes into designing the pencil and setting up the machines. And is there more for the mechanical than for the plain pencil? Probably, I would think so. What about labor hours? I don't know, maybe there's some difference there, but that's anything that's direct we can trace. So indirect stuff, the overhead, we need a good way of assigning it, maybe not just across the whole plant, but maybe to separate units or maybe separate departments or something like that. So that's what we're going to talk about. So first we're going to talk a little bit about plant-wide overhead costing, because sometimes that's fine. Sometimes all you make is pencils, and even if they're different, they're not that different, right? And you can do some plant-wide overhead costing. It's certainly easier and cheaper to do it that way. Then we'll talk a little bit about, well, maybe that may not be the best, so what's our other alternative? Activity-based costing, which I'll probably call ABC a lot, activity-based costing. So we're going to talk about that, and we will be moving along with activity-based cost. First of all, we're going to do what we call our plant-wide overhead. So as you've probably noticed, when we do our costing, we take our direct materials and trace them to a product. So like when we said our pencils, we got wood, lead, metal, rubber. We know how much goes in a pencil. We trace it and we can come up with the cost per unit for a pencil for the direct materials. We know how much we pay the people who work on the factory floor, our line employees, as the book calls them. So we can trace our direct labor, right? But then we've got this overhead. So the supervisors, the plant managers, people cleaning up the plant, engineering, designing, anything that's not directly going into making our pencil is overhead. The air conditioning. Now, what we've been doing is coming up with like a plant. What we plan to do is come up with some kind of plant level cost pool and put all those overheads into one cost pool. So we take the supervisor salaries and the air conditioning cost and the cleanup costs and things like that aren't direct, and put them all in one pool and divide it by something, right? And come up with a rate and apply that to our units as we make them. And that's not a bad idea, and sometimes it's just fine. You take your budgeted annual overhead, right? Well, I think my company headquarters and my supervisors and all the stuff that's overhead is going to be $1 million, and whatever my driver is, I don't know, pencils. We're going to make $1 million, right? So $1 per pencil. All right, something like that. So you take your annual overhead, divide it by your whatever your driver is, and that's your rate. And then you apply it as you go. I've made one pencil. Let me add $1 overhead. Made 2 pencils, $2 overhead. Right, so you just add it as you go. And that's fine. It's a very easy way to do things that measures based on unit level, right? So the more units you make, the more you add overhead. Or maybe it's not on units, maybe it's on number of pencils, but labor hours, right? It takes a minute to make a pencil. So for every minute that goes by, we'll charge overhead on the machine, or every machine hour, or something like that. Direct material, whatever. So you pick some unit and you use that to apply your overhead. Pretty easy. It's great. You do it as you go along and you apply your overhead, $1 per pencil or whatever it is, 50 cents per labor hour, whatever you've decided your overhead rate is, and you apply it. And then at the end of the year you look back and you say, well, how much overhead did I actually end up having? And then you either guessed right or were a little bit off. If you're a little bit off, we call that a variance. So there's a difference between the at the end of the year, say, oh, well, here's my actual overhead. It didn't turn out to be $1 per pencil, it turned out to be 90 cents per pencil. Okay, well, you didn't know that when you started, but that's okay. You know, so then you're going to make an adjustment and take care of that overhead variance. All right, so how do you take care of it? Well, typically what you do is when your overhead's a little bit off at the end of the year, you go, well, I've been applying it this way all along and now I'm $50,000 off. Okay, well, when you think about what happens, right, as we are producing, let's say, pencils, the direct materials moves to work in process, the direct labor moves to work in process, and the overhead moves to work in process, and it becomes eventually finished goods, and then when you sell them, they become cost of goods sold. So typically what we do at the end of the year, hey, that variance was really just a period cost, so we'll throw it into cost of goods sold, and we just add that $50,000 to cost of goods sold, so we increase that expense by debiting it. If that variance was really big, let's say we're bad estimators, and that variance was what we would call material to our other inventories, well, then we'd allocate it, right? We would add it, some to work in process, some to finished goods, and some to cost of goods sold, right? Instead of just adding that variance all to cost of goods sold. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along in other chapters, you can bet. So when we're doing unit level product costing, sometimes we add our overhead to at departmental rates. So you can imagine as you're making a pencil, maybe we have the wood lathing part where they mold the pencil wood, and then we have the assembly part where they put the wood and the metal and the rubber all together. So you got two different departments, right? So sometimes you'll assign costs creating a department cost pool, right? So instead of taking like all your overhead through the whole place, what we call plant wide, and making one cost pool, sometimes we'll say, well, there's the lathing department for the wood and the assembly department for everything else. And so maybe we'll split up costs between those because they're kind of different. You know, the lathing is all by machine and the assembly department is all by people. So we're gonna, you know, they run at different rates. So we're gonna have different drivers for our two departments instead of just one big plant-wide rate. And so then you do the same thing. You say, okay, well, how much was my department rate for this department? How much overhead did I spend for this department? How much overhead did I spend for that department? Divide it by whatever my driver is, labor hours, and then you get a rate for the department. It's all kind of the same idea. All right? So plant-wide and department rates assume that a product's consumption is related to its units produced, but some things, it doesn't matter how many products get produced. So a lot of times we use non-unit related drivers. All right, so here's an issue. We talked about mechanical pencil versus plain pencil. So even if there's not non-unit driven overhead costs, you know, sometimes making different kinds of things are going to make overhead different. So that's what we're getting at. It's easy to trace the direct costs, but assigning that overhead can be a problem. So we try to get as good as we can at it, And what we do is we come up with some solutions for product diversity. So what happens is they're using different activities in different proportions, right? And we've got these limitations, right? So what I want to do is come back and talk about distinctions and limitations between any kind of products or departments, and we'll talk about what limits them, what are our issues, then we'll get into activity-based costing and how they can solve that.